Welcome to Planting the Spring Vegetable Garden. This is this is Christmas time for vegetables, when you can plant so many different things and get wonderful, wonderful produce during the summer by planting in the spring. Early in the spring, which is now, middle of March, it's still pretty cool and the nights are very cool. And so we are continuing to grow leafy vegetables and things like lettuces and kales. We can put in a crop of things like broccoli and get a quick crop before it warms up in the summer. And we can start thinking about summer vegetables like tomatoes and peppers and squash and string beans. And later on melons in some parts of the Bay Area. And so we'll talk about all of those a little bit. We will talk in more detail about tomatoes in particular at a webinar a little later on, so look at the schedule. And we'll talk about peppers in detail as well in a subsequent webinar. Arrayed in front of me here are a vast number of different kinds of things that we can start to think about growing, from tomatoes on my right, obviously lettuces and leafy things here, strawberries over here, wonderful plants like a tree kale here, artichokes, this is a pepper here, and we have some blueberries down below, and I can't resist showing you this blueberry is blooming like crazy. This blueberry has already bloomed and has formed the berries. So we're getting an array of seasonal berries here. This one obviously won't set the berries for a little while and won't mature the berries till probably a month after the one on the right. So that it gives you a graphic illustration of how by planting different varieties of the same plant, you can extend the season that you can harvest. And that's true of vegetables like tomatoes as well. Early in the season, we want to plant the tomatoes that can handle the cool and that can mature quickly. And for later in the season, we can try to grow some of the larger tomatoes that take more time to ripen. And we'll talk about that a little bit. We can't do planting your vegetable garden without talking about space. And around here, people have space that varies from, an entire huge backyard to a few pots on a deck. And so we want to be able to satisfy everyone's desire to grow a little bit of produce. And I can assure you, you can do it in a very small space. If you are just beginning, I would suggest you start with a very small space and have some success, get some experience, and then expand from there. A good starting area would be about 4 feet by 4 feet square, or about a 3-foot circle, something that's going to give you about 10 to 15, 16 square feet, where you can reach every bit of it from the outside. So you can cultivate, you can dig, you can plant, you can harvest, and you can keep your eye on it. Because part of vegetable gardening is being attentive to your vegetables and not just setting them out and then forgetting them for a month and then coming back and saying, oh golly, something's been eating them and it isn't me. So if it's a small area, you can actually do that by just walking by it and taking a quick look and, is everything growing nicely? Is something having a problem? Maybe I can attend to it a little bit. A 3-foot diameter is just, well, about the size of a wine barrel. A wine barrel is a little bit smaller than that, but a wine barrel is a great way to visualize, or a half barrel is a great way to visualize sort of a starting garden. And in containers, you're going to want to start with some good quality potting soil in the container and a little bit of added fertilizer. In the ground, you're going to want to figure out what kind of soil you have, make some amendments to the soil, make sure that it's kind of at the right water level before you mess with it, and then be prepared to plant. Around here, we have soils that vary from very sandy in the western part of San Francisco to heavy, heavy clay in parts and everything in between. Right here on Miller Avenue in Mill Valley, we're right next to the main creek that comes off of the Mount Tamalpais and runs through Mill Valley and flooded for eons before people started to live here. So we have a nice alluvial soil here, but also a very high water table that keeps the soil very wet during the winter, even in a drought year like this. Other places will have soils that drain very fast and that dry out quickly. So it's important that you get some understanding of what your soil is like. Sandy soils have big particles that allow moisture to run through very quickly, and they don't retain moisture very well, and they don't retain minerals very well, nutrition for the plants. Clay soils have tiny little particles that pack together densely, and they hold water very well, but they exclude air, and they can sometimes hold on to the minerals so tightly that the plants can't get to them. And the good news is that you can make both of those types of soils better by adding organic matter. It's very simple. Compost, planting mix, even potting soils will help to break up the clay particles into little larger particles, and they'll help to give some sponginess to sandy soils so that they'll hold more moisture and more nutrition. So organic matter, organic matter, organic matter is the watchword for improving soils. And the mantra is, I am building soil, not I am, just sticking vegetables in the ground and hoping they will grow. So every time you replant vegetables, you want to add organic matter to your soil. Or in the case of containers, you want to add back what decomposes most quickly, which are the compost, leafy compost, and manure components. So I recommend that on the soil, you add compost and manure at the rate of about 3 parts compost to 1 part manure, and no more than about a 2-inch thick layer dug into the soil. In a container, I like to start with good quality potting soil. That can be slope organic potting soil, which is down there.
That's beautiful.
There are premium potting soils like Fox Farm and the Formula 420, which are very expensive and are frankly marketed for marijuana growing. And I have grown vegetables in those as well as the slope organic potting with a little additional fertilizer and had good results in all of them. So I don't think there's really a need to go big time on the premium potting soils. Some of my customers mix the premium potting soils with the more mundane potting soil, if you will. The analogy here is to cooking. I may give you a recipe, and if you're a real beginner, follow the recipe. But as you gain experience, experiment, see what works for you, see what works for the kinds of plants that you're growing, and diverge from the recipe and make your own. Every gardener should have basically their own recipe based on their microclimate, their terroir, if you will, and it's all different. And by the way, most of our suburban gardening isn't really done on pure native soil. When houses are built, the lots are usually scraped of most of the topsoil. After the house is built, often they'll bring topsoil in from someplace else. We have no idea where. And so your soil could be completely different from your next door neighbors. And that's just a fact of suburban life. I have a backyard with a huge retaining wall, and it appears that they just filled that whole back of the retaining wall with construction debris and put a thin layer of soil over the top. And it's very challenging gardening. But I'm not going to dig down 10 feet and take all of that junk out of there. I'll build soil over time. Fertilizer is critical for vegetables. They tend to grow quickly. They are making fruit, lots of them, which requires making lots of sugars and proteins, and they need fertilizer. You can't really grow vegetables without any added fertilizer unless you are just a super composter and very, very, very diligent about what you put in the compost so that you get all kinds of different elements in there. So I do recommend slow release organic fertilizers added at the time of planting. And those can be pre-mixed, like this is packaged as tomato vegetable food. The major elements are nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium or potash. And you can see 4, 5, 3, they're fairly balanced. With organic fertilizer mixes, you're never going to get outlandish big numbers. 7% is probably going to be the highest you'll see for nitrogen, for instance. With a synthetic fertilizer, you can get 20% nitrogen, but it's going to be pretty much water soluble and it's going to disappear relatively quickly. Organic forms of nitrogen are derived from things like blood meal and bird guano and bat guano. And they require biological action to decompose and become available to the plants. So they're a nice addition. These fertilizers also have mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria that are beneficial added to them. And that is something that we've learned over time with research that's critically important for root development in particular, and for the exchange of minerals and nutrition between the soil and the plant. The fungi and bacteria do a big part of that job for the plants. You want to read the ingredients of fertilizer just like you read the ingredients of food. I don't suspect you can see that very clearly, but it lists the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potash, and some of the slightly less important minerals or less abundant minerals in here, calcium and sulfur. Calcium is critical for many of the fruit-bearing vegetables, tomatoes, squash, peppers in particular need substantial amounts of calcium or they get a funny little condition called blossom end rot that ruins the fruit. So you want to add a source of calcium into the soil or into your potting mix at the time of planting. That can come from the fertilizer that has the calcium in it already. It should be at least 3%, which is what this is. Or you can add calcium with something like oyster shell, which has got a lot of calcium in it, but it takes a little while to become available. If you get it in at the time of planting, you won't have a problem with blossom end rot. If you do get blossom end rot, there are products you can buy to spray on the foliage, and the plant can absorb calcium very quickly. There's one called Folical. And I've had plants that had a crop of bad fruit from blossom end rot, sprayed it with Folical, it absorbs the calcium through the leaves, and the next crop of fruit was fine. So it's not the end of the world if it happens, but you'll avoid the problem if you get the calcium in at the time of planting. The sunshine is an important component to think about. You have to have a good 6 hours of sun from about 10 o'clock to about 4 o'clock to be considered full sun. And most of the fruit-bearing vegetables are going to require full sun to avoid either very thin crops or being disease-prone because they're not getting enough sun. They need to keep growing quickly to keep producing the fruit. Tomato vines should get up 6 feet. Beans should get up 6 feet. Zucchini on the ground should spread out 10 feet if they're happy. And although there are bush forms that don't do it. And if you can't give them that kind of sunshine, then you have to think about what should I really grow in this spot that has less sun. And you're not stuck, but you should concentrate more on leafy vegetables that don't produce fruit and root crops. And things like strawberries can actually grow in quite a bit of shade and still produce quite well. The strawberries were originally, in their sort of wild form, were a woodland little plant that grew under trees and got sort of dappled sunlight. And of course, they've been worked on over the years to produce the great big berries that we like today, but originally they were quite tiny. This is a woodland strawberry here. It doesn't have any fruit yet, but this will have little fruit that are about 1/2 inch in length, intensely flavored, and can grow very nicely in dappled sun.
Those are the alpine strawberries.
These are alpine strawberries, right? And you can kind of see that you don't see a lot of difference here, but this is a variety that would be a commercial variety, Eversweet, which is a nice ever-bearing strawberry, but it's going to need more sun because it's been bred, if you will, to make big fruit, which means more sugars, more proteins, and the only place the plants get the ability to make those is by converting sunlight into energy. Fertilizer supports that, but fertilizer itself does not create any structures. All of the structure building comes from energy derived from light in plants. It kind of explains why an apple tree really has to be out in the sunshine to produce big apples with lots of sugar in them. Now, let's see here. I realized as I talk to people here at the nursery that not everyone has prepared soil in their lifetime. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about basic tools and what you do with them and sort of how soil preparation in the ground happens. We don't have any soil here, but if your soil is damp, as it should be this time of year, the first thing you want to do is dig up, here's a trowel, dig up a trowel full of soil and squish it in your hand and drop it on the ground. And if it goes plop and stays like a chunk out of your ice cream cone fell on the ground, it's too wet to work. And you will only make the texture of the soil worse by trying to work it when it's in that condition. So go out a week later and take another chunk and squeeze it and plop it. And when it breaks into pieces, then it's ready to work. If you've ever made a mud pie or worked with clay, you know that when it is super saturated and dries, it is like a rock. And that's what can happen with soil. If you work it when it's too wet, you'll basically disengage the particles and they'll mix with the water and they will dry and become like cement or adobe. So test it, then work it. If you have a sandier soil, that's not going to be a problem. When you do this, it's not even going to make a ball in your hand. It's just going to fall apart. So you know you can work that. And you don't really need to turn sandy soil very much. All you need to do is work in some organic matter. To turn soil for the first time, you need something like a shovel. And you want to go down about a shovel length and turn it over and kind of break it up like that. So you just dig, turn, break, dig, turn, break. And after you've dug, turned, and break, then something like a fork is very handy for doing it some more. And very handy for working in a layer of compost and manure. Spread it on, work it with the fork. Break it up.
I can imagine it.
For a really small
Good.
area, one of these gizmos is wonderful. And especially if your soil is a little softer, you can chop, 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 chop very quickly. Use this for planting. Very handy. But your basic tools are a fork and a shovel. If you have a steel rake with strong tines, you can use that for smoothing out the soil after you've turned it. So those are just sort of the basic tools. After you've prepared it with some organic matter and fertilizer wise, what I generally do is add about a cup of fertilizer for about a 4x4 area at the time of planting. So just kind of turn that in so that you know you've got it in there. You can add more about a month later, just sprinkling it on top and maybe scratching it in with a tool like this or with your hands even. But important to get a little bit in there at the time of planting. Now, we have a pretty good planting chart on our website at slopegardens.com, which will tell you month by month recommended planting times for many of the vegetables. But since the weather is and the climate is so variable around the Bay Area, you shouldn't take that as gospel. I think it's a little bit West Bay centric, I would say. and the warmer climates like in the 680 corridor, you actually have an extended planting time for some of the warmer weather vegetables. Oh, thank you, Jim. Also, I want to point out that on the outline that you presumably have, Pam Pierce's Golden Gate Gardening is the one resource you might want to spend some money on if you're serious about trying to garden vegetables in the Bay Area. It is a fantastic resource. Has 3 different planting charts in it for coastal and bay and inland gardening, and she's goes through just about every vegetable and herb you can think of in detail for planting tips and growing tips and some recipes. The other reference there is Mel Bartholomew's all new square foot gardening, which is I found a terrific way to visualize spacing in your garden. We aren't gardening 100 acres or 40 acres with a mule or whatever. So we don't have to pull a plow through long lines and think linearly. We can think more in area terms and get much more planted in our gardens. And what Mel does in that book is suggest that you think in terms of 1 foot square areas in your garden. And I actually lined off a garden with string into 1 square foot sections. And then you can think about, well, I can plant a whole 6-pack of lettuce in a 1 square foot area if I want to harvest them as they grow by picking leaves off them as they harvest. I can pack them in. But I could only plant, say, 1 broccoli plant in that same square foot area because it's going to get pretty big. Or I could plant 1 tomato in about a 2 by 2 area, for instance, about 4 square feet for 1 tomato. And it gives you a little bit of a heads up as to just how much you can get in the garden.
Hey Dan, can you repeat the reference that you're talking about again? People are wondering about
Yes.
the book and stuff to be able to pick it up.
The book is called All New Square Foot Gardening, and the author is Mel Bartholomew. And did we publish the outline?
That should be on their outline, which they would have received an hour ago. If they don't have it, Taylor, maybe you can look up the link on the website and put it in the chat. It's just, if you search outline on the website, it'll pop up.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, but I found it was a real nice way to visualize growing different kinds of crops near each other and allowing them enough space to grow and not wasting space by giving the lettuce an entire square foot when it, per plant, when it doesn't need that. Intercropping is a real good idea for many reasons. But one of them is that it confuses insects a little bit. They may get a whiff of something they like. They're headed for the lettuce, for instance, and then they get a whiff of chives or an onion and go, oh, I don't like those, I'm going somewhere else. So mixing things up is a good idea in terms of confusing the insects and not giving them a big field of one particular plant that they can chow down on. What can I grow when is a critical question, and that's where the planting charts come in, but also our nights in the Bay Area are just plain cold, and they stay cold year round, but they're quite cold now in vegetable terms. And as a result, our soil is cold too. So things that are real summer vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squash, and melons in particular need the soil to warm up to be able to thrive. Although tomatoes are available at the nurseries now, and I do recommend you go and shop for them now because you'll get them fresh and you'll get a good selection. And it doesn't mean today necessarily, but within the next month to month and a half. The soil's too cold for them to go into the ground. And if you do plant them into the ground, they're just going to sit there until the ground warms up, and they're going to suffer some on the top, and they're going to be weaker for a while at least, and subject to fungal diseases and that sort of thing. So what I recommend with those guys is to buy them, and this is the size you're generally going to find, although they're, you know, even this year they're available larger very early. Here's this is a 3.5 inch baby wine tomato, and this is a 1 gallon size early girl tomato. Then you can see there's a significant difference in the size. If I were buying this, I would just leave it in this 1 gallon container for about a month in a nice sheltered warm spot like a south facing wall or something like that, and let it grow. Give it some fertilizer, water it regularly, and let it grow, and then put it into the ground. And if I were buying a little one, I would transplant it into a gallon size container and do the same thing, let it grow. You could even put the 1 gallon into a 2 gallon and it would benefit. And this is actually a 3 gallon. This is about as large as you're going to want to go to if you're later going to transplant into the ground. It's still manageable in this size. If you go to a 5 gallon, they're just that much more difficult to transplant. But the little ones should go into a gallon to start with. I want to show you what the roots look like, even in this little guy. You can see this is an enthusiastic tomato. It wants to grow, and it's made it to the edge of the little container, and it's starting to have to grow around a little bit. And so it's ready to get into something a little bigger. These are some really fresh roots right here that are just coming out of the soil. Little tomatoes like this, assuming they're not grafted tomatoes, which we'll talk about, they can be planted quite deep. So in other words, the soil that they're going to go into can come up way up on the stem. About the original cotyledon leaves that the seed sprouted were down here. I would plant this one up to about here, and roots will grow out of the stem of the tomato, and you'll have a much stronger root system as a result. I also like to interfere a little bit with the way the roots are growing around the edge of the pot, and I like to rough up the surface so that there's more surface area to interact, so that the new soil can interact with the old soil. And I'm not really worried about these roots that have been circling around the bottom. I want to get rid of those so they have to grow out fresh into the new soil. And this plant will do that very readily. Did I have a small bag of potting soil here? Yeah, there we go. Any I'm just gonna put some potting soil in here. And everywhere else. Julie's child would have said, don't be itsy pooey. Get your fingers in there and do it. So this is rather dry potting soil. So if I were doing this with more foresight, let's say, I would have moistened the potting soil a little bit for planting. And so I filled that up so full that I'm gonna have to take some out here so that I can get my tomato to the right level in here. Because I want it, I want the soil to come up the stem. And I want to add some of my calcium-laden tomato vegetable fertilizer. I would judge this to be about a tablespoon of fertilizer. And I'm going to sprinkle it in there and then just mix it in to the top few inches so it'll be ready as the roots grow out. And I'm going to put the plant in. And then I'm going to put a little more fertilizer in the potting soil in the bag. And then
So it's how many? It's maybe like 3 inches below the rim, I would say, right?
yeah, it's 2.5 inches to 3 inches below the rim, so that the new potting soil will come up the stem, and then the stem will be encouraged to grow more roots. And when I do this, I generally hang a flexible label on the tomato. I have the label, the baby wine label, which I would put in here, but I also like to hang a flexible label on the tomato with the variety name, because these often disappear. These little tags, they break or they come out and get lost, and then I don't know what variety it is. So if I hang a label on it that I won't lose, then if I have success with the tomato, I'll know what it was. Or if I don't, turns out I don't like the way it grows, or it's not successful, I'll say, well, maybe I'm not going to try that one next year. There's so many people who come into the nursery and say, oh, I had this wonderful tomato last year. Yeah, well, it was really tasty. Yeah. Wait, any idea what kind it was? Oh, no. Well, so try some that and see if they're tasty this year, but maybe keep track of what it is, and then you can repeat your success. Anyway, this is a tomato that's ready to grow out for about a month or so in the 1 gallon container. I would water it, obviously. As it grows, you'll want to put a stake in it to keep it growing upwards, probably. These bamboo stakes, they don't have to be even this fat. You can get a package of a dozen or 15 of these for a reasonable price. They're usually tinted green. They're really easy to cut with your pruning shears. I find they're just one of the most useful tools in the garden. I always have a package of bamboo stakes around for supporting different plants at different times. Now, just very quickly, grafted tomatoes are becoming more and more popular and more available. And there is a significant difference between them and a seedling tomato like this one that I just planted. And that is that a tomato has been grown to a certain point and then snipped off. A tomato grown for its roots rather than for its top, its roots being stronger and more disease resistant and more tolerant of different soil conditions. And then a fruiting tomato of a certain variety has been grafted on top of that rootstock. Since it's the rootstock that we want for its roots alone, we don't want to plant a grafted tomato deep. Probably can't see it, but there's a little graft scar right here, which shows you where the top of the tomato was grafted onto the rootstock. And that always wants to be up in the air so that roots don't grow out of the fruiting tomato part and into the ground. That would defeat the purpose of buying the rootstock that it's grafted onto. And I suggest grafted tomatoes to people, especially for the larger, more difficult to grow varieties around here. Because of our cold nights, it's hard to ripen a large tomato. Grafting can help with that. And so whenever you get a tomato larger than this would be like a small slicer, this size, anything larger than that and longer than about 75 days to maturity, experiment with a grafted tomato. They cost a little more at the get-go, but they can be well worth it in success and the amount of tomatoes that you get down the road. Tomatoes are usually listed by length to maturity, which means from the time you set out a small plant like this to the time it produces ripe fruit will be a certain number of days. So that'll vary from about 55 days for the very earliest to about 90 days for the latest. And those dates assume perfect tomato weather, which means nights about 65 degrees and days about 85 degrees. And we do not have those. So our tomatoes always take longer to ripen than it says on the seed package or on the tag here. This says baby wine, I think is about a 75 day tomato, no, 80-day tomato. So you could probably figure that with our weather, it'll take 90 to 100 days to produce a ripe tomato. Now, the other thing that produces is a thicker, tougher skin usually. The skin's just been on the tomato longer, it's had a chance to grow thicker, and we're never going to get a large tomato with the delicate, thin skin that you'll get in a warmer climate. But we'll talk about more of that in the tomato class. Let's talk about some of the things that are particularly curious about the springtime, and that is the things like potatoes are available. These are what we call seed potatoes. Hey, that's just a potato that's sprouted, isn't it? Yes, it is. And what you do is you plant the whole potato in the ground or in a pot, and you let it grow, and it grows a top that looks a lot like a tomato. And then it makes tubers on the roots under the ground, and they're actually extremely easy to grow and quite satisfying to dig down and collect them up. And they're available, all kinds of interesting little varieties. This one's called the banana, which you've probably seen in fancier grocery stores. This is a purple one with a white flesh called Huckleberry Gold. And there are, at your typical nursery this time of year, there will probably be at least half a dozen varieties available, but they won't be available for long. They're already starting to sprout in the package, and once they've really sprouted, they're not going to be good for planting anymore. You do want to buy certified seed potatoes because they will be disease-free. That's what the certification is. And that doesn't mean diseases that we could get. it means diseases that the tomato plant can get and that can ruin the entire crop very easily. And even a nice organically grown potato from the good earth or wherever is not going to be a disease-free tomato in that sense. It's going to be fine for us. But if you grow it in the garden, you're playing Russian roulette. It has hidden in it a pathogen that is going to ruin your crop and maybe ruin your area for growing potatoes for several years. So I do recommend you get certified seed potatoes to start. Another nice plant to get started right now is asparagus. And asparagus will be available for a little while, bare root, which means it's roots and crowns. Rubber banded together here. All right.
Hey Dan, while you're talking about this, can you also go over the light requirements for like seed potatoes and even the asparagus and stuff like that, some of the tubers?
Yeah, they should be in full sun pretty much. The potatoes obviously themselves are going to go underground, as are the crowns of the asparagus. Here is an asparagus crown, and you can see it sprouting. This is going to be an asparagus shoot that's going to come up and make the first year, you're just going to let these grow and make a bunch of sprouts, and it'll make a kind of feathery leaf and may even bloom a yellow flower. But you just let them grow and then die down. And then the following year, you might be able to start harvesting some asparagus. They need asparagus probably require a little less sun than potatoes, for instance. With potatoes, you need a lot of sun because you want them to store a bunch of energy in those tubers underground. Asparagus, you want nice strong shoots out of it. And since it's a deciduous, it dies down during the winter, it has to store the energy that's in the leaves as well as energy that it's been storing during the growing season down in the crown, so it can send up these big, finger-sized shoots eventually. So the more sun you can give them, the better. But they will grow and produce for you in less than, ideal conditions. What you usually do for both potatoes and asparagus is plant them in the ground. You make like a trench and prepare the soil and then plant them. And then as they grow up, you add more soil as they're coming, so they don't have to push their way through so much soil that first year. Not critical to do. In a pot, you can just put them down there and you'll have nice loose potting soil and they'll come up through it real easily. Potatoes, they make potato containers, the cloth type of planting containers that have flaps inside, so you can just reach into the pot underground and feel around for the potatoes. Kind of a funny idea. This, which looks like I don't know, a chunk of bear poop or something that you'd stumble across in the woods. This is actually a rhubarb root, and it's completely dormant. You can see that it's going to sprout out here. This is where the growing part was, but then it went dormant, and the root has stored a ton of energy in it. So if you put this in the ground with the crown right at the surface, it'll grow some roots, and then it'll push out some big old rhubarb leaves, and you can make your rhubarb pie, keeping in mind that the only part of rhubarb that's not poisonous are the stalks, the stems. You don't eat the leaves, you don't eat the roots. They're quite toxic. And then this is kind of fun. This is horseradish, which again is a root. It's the energy storage facility of the plant. And it looks like a mini rhubarb root kind of. But you would just plant that with the crown fairly close to the surface, and it'll sprout out roots and send up more greenery, and then you're going to, of course, harvest the root in this case. And what you do is harvest some of the roots and leave the rest of the roots in the ground to grow for the next year. But those are kind of some of the different and kind of fun things that are available only in the spring right now. And plants will be available later sometimes of rhubarb and even horseradish, but they're not as satisfying to grow, and you get better results with the dormant roots than you do with plants later on in the season for some reason.
Dan, would you combine, potatoes and would you combine all those in one bed, or would you kind of like do some lettuce with potato, in terms of combination?
Yeah, in terms of combinations, it's a little hard to grow potatoes, say, with a bunch of other crops because you got to dig down and harvest the potatoes. So it's okay to put a crop that's going to be finished before you're ready to get the potatoes, like lettuces or arugula, things like that are kind of light. They're not going to compete a lot, and they're going to be finished by the time you get to digging up the potatoes. The more permanent residents, like the roots, like the rhubarb, the horseradish, the asparagus, you kind of want to have a spot for each of those. You don't want to plant stuff on top of asparagus because you don't want the competition. Rhubarb gets quite big. It will be larger than this artichoke here. You get big leaves, and you need some room for rhubarb. And the horseradish, again, is going to stay in the ground, and so you want to give it enough area to reproduce itself, send out new root chunks, so that you'll have more for the following year. So, like everything, as everything, it depends. But think in terms of, I have some crops that are going to take a long time, and I have some crops that are going to be real quick. For instance, let's talk about radishes. Now, this is a white icicle radish, but if you like little red radishes or French breakfast radishes, radishes are one of the easiest crops to grow, and one of the quickest crops to grow.
Good for kids.
And they're wonderful for kids. The seeds are relatively big, easy to plant. They sprout quickly. A French breakfast radish, for instance, will be ready about 30 days after planting. And so you can see how I might be able to plant radishes on top of lots of different things, or right next to lots of different things, because I'm going to be plucking them out of the ground pretty quickly. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to plant my artichoke right next to where I'm growing, a crop that is also going to have to stay in the ground. Artichokes can go year after year after year, and they can get huge. I don't want them encroaching on my bed of asparagus, where they're going to be shading it out, and they're going to be competing for nutrients with the asparagus. So I want to give those room, but planting some arugula, which is about a 30-day crop, on top of them wouldn't be a problem at all. They grow right up through the arugula, and then I'm going to be plucking the arugula out after it grows for a little while and starts to flower.
Yeah, or something fun like the violas too.
Or, well, sure, I can always grow violas with almost anything. And by the way, violas are one of the yummier flowers that you can grow. They're absolutely delicious and
And
very
pretty.
decorative in a
Mhm.
salad. Calendulas are also quite good. And what I usually do with calendulas is pluck the flowers. You don't, the center part is kind of gummy and chewy, but the petals
Yeah.
are very tasty.
And talking about planting things together, we had someone asking, well, first someone was asking about planting potatoes in a half wine barrel or some sort of larger planter like that, and that kind of difference in growing compared to the ground. And then also I think planting stuff around each other, especially inside containers. What's the
A wine barrel is great for potatoes, and you could absolutely grow some of the lighter crops, the lettuces, arugula, even bunching onions, which are never, they're not the big bulbing onions. These are just going to be scallions, or you're even just going to use the tops like chives. And they're never going to get real big. So those could grow with the potatoes, no problem. Certainly the violas can be grown with them. And you can do some planning in the barrel and figure, well, I'm going to go ahead and plant sort of the outer circle with something like strawberries. And then I'll still be able to get in there and dig around in the middle without destroying the strawberries and get at the potatoes. So now, one thing I want to caution you about is you don't want to grow potatoes and tomatoes and peppers together. Tomatoes and potatoes in particular are pretty closely related, and they're both subject to a lot of the same diseases, particularly the disease that wiped out the Irish potato crop. And you can spread some of these pathogens from tomatoes to potatoes and vice versa. Peppers are a little further removed, but in the same family. And so I like to separate them a little bit as well. But definitely keep your tomatoes and your potatoes in different spots. And if you grow potatoes one year in the ground, don't grow your tomatoes in that same ground the next year. Keep them separate.
Yeah, I actually had a question earlier on I was answering about the crop rotation and using different plants in different areas, like especially using this different plant than a tomato in this place that you planted a tomato before. Is there some options of plants you like that you can maybe use in that spot?
Well, you certainly in soil that you've grown either potatoes or tomatoes in, if you stay away from the potato family, the Solanaceae, which primarily are tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes. Stay away from those, and you can grow anything else. Those diseases are not going to hurt lettuce or kale or strawberries or any of the melons or the zucchini squash or anything like that. So
I'm suggesting maybe like peas, like the Fabaceae and stuff like that too. The peas.
Oh yeah, peas and beans definitely, no problem at all. And here in springtime, if you have peas growing, they're going to continue for quite a long time. You might even be able to plant one more crop of peas and to take you a little further along, but it's getting to be warm enough now to start planting beans, and those are going to take you through the summer and into the fall. And peas and beans are both legumes, so they have the capability of sequestering some nitrogen from the air into the soil, and are real good crops to rotate through all of your planting beds. And this can include even sweet peas, which aren't edible but are a real pretty flower, they're useful for that. And some of the bigger beans, like fava beans, are typically, often anyway, grown as a cover crop between other crops, and then turned into the soil. You grow them up until the point where they just flower. And by that time, they've taken nitrogen out of the air and put it in root nodules, and you turn them in, and that turns into good fertilizer for your plants. But that's a little elaborate and not something you're going to do in a container garden or a small garden, probably. But you can look for other cover crops. Clover is another source of nitrogen fixing in the soil. So if you have an area that you're really not going to garden very much for a while, get a cover crop from a seed source, your local nursery, whatever, and let them grow, and then turn them into the soil when you're ready to get going again. That's a good way to go. Certain plants should probably be grown from seed if you can do it. Root crops in particular, carrots, radishes. The difficulty with growing them from or buying them already started is that it can be hard to transplant them without breaking them. Or if they've been sitting too long in their little cell packs. Let's see, I guess I didn't grab any carrots here, but usually this is lettuce, and it's just barely grown to the edge of the cell, which is nice. It's nice and fresh. But if you see just a ton of roots wrapped around the bottom of the cell, and go ahead and pop it out of the cell and look at it. We nursery people might cringe, but as a consumer, you should go ahead and do that. Take a look, nice and fresh, I'll buy it. If it's all packed in there, especially if it's a root crop, don't buy it. It's never going to make good carrots. If you find a cell pack that's really fresh looking, then the thing to do is put the whole cell pack, this is carrots or bunched up onions or something, things you have to separate, put the whole cell pack into a bucket or a pan of water and let it sit there until it is just super soggy. And then, take the pieces out and leave them in there, and then swoosh them around until you wash the soil off the roots, and then you can separate the plants and plant them individually. But they really, for carrots in particular, it has to look like a little taproot carrot, and then you have to very carefully plant it so you don't break it. If you break a carrot root, it will branch out into all kinds of weird fingers, and then it'll break off when you try to pull it out of the ground. So those should probably be started in place by seed, and it's easy to do, especially radishes, but carrots are easy to do too. Get some of the shorter carrots to start with, at least, until you know that you're having success. This is a carrot called Little Finger, which is about a half-size carrot. It's going to be about that long. So you work the soil well so it's nice and loose, and then plant your seeds, and you should be able to grow these relatively quickly and easily. Beets are another one that is good to start from seed, and radishes. And then some of the larger seeds, like string beans, it's fine to buy them in 6-packs from the nursery. There's no problem transplanting them at all. But the seeds are fairly large and easy to deal with. What I do is take the package of seeds, and however many I want to plant, I dump them into a glass of water overnight so they absorb some water, and then plant them, and they usually sprout within a couple of days, and they can grow very strongly right from the get-go, Jack of the Beanstalk style. And there's no reason not to start them right in place if you have the willingness to do that. And you can, these days, this is a French fillet bean, readily available. And for my taste anyway, more tender, more flavorful than the typical big old honking green bean you find at the grocery store, which is, much larger. I pick them when they're quite young and tender. I would never let my beans get that big unless I just missed one.
I just recently learned, like within the last few years, that carrots are really good to plant with tomatoes.
Yes, supposedly that's a good combination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is some people actually asking also about going back to the carrots and the radishes and stuff. Someone was saying that they were struggling a little bit with radishes. I think a lot of your tips about making sure that you are being careful with the root system and how you're planting them is really good. They're also wondering, is there anything about like the nutrients or the soil you have to worry about for carrots and radishes and stuff? Like, is there a fertilizer you should maybe add in first or add in later?
Yes. Again, a balanced fertilizer, about equal amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash will be fine for the root crops. These are, for things like bulbs, you usually go very heavily on the phosphorus and potash, but we're not making bulbs here. We are picking the root while the plant is still actively growing, and so we need a certain amount of nitrogen as well all through the growing season for those root crops, even though their growing season is short. So a little bit of balanced fertilizer. If you have some Sure Start at home, that's close enough. I mean, the difference is 4, 6, 2, and 4, 5, 3.
For the numbers, yeah.
Not a whole lot of difference here. And I see no reason to have 20 different kinds of fertilizers just because the marketers have listed them as this is vegetable fertilizer, this is starter fertilizer, this is shrub fertilizer. Come on, it's all fertilizer. And if it's reasonably balanced, use it up. It's better to use it while it's relatively fresh. The fertilizer elements aren't going to go away with time, but the bacteria and fungi that are added will get less active 5 years from now. So use up what you got, and then don't worry about it. That's my mantra. Don't worry about it.
Excellent.
You go for it. Let's see. Let me look at the outline here and see what else. When can I grow the warmer temperature plants? Well, as we talked about with tomatoes, about a month from now you could put them in the ground. Don't do it before that. Put them in a pot, fine. They can warm up during the day. They'll cool off at night, but at least they'll warm up. The roots will warm up during the day. Same with peppers and eggplant. And with eggplant, you have to have the sunniest darn spot you've got in the garden, even warmer than for the peppers or the tomatoes, for it to really thrive. But it will thrive, especially the Japanese long eggplant do very well around here as the days get longer and the ground warms up a little bit. Basil, are you asking about basil? Yes, you are. Basil will start to be available at the nursery soon. It's still too cold at night for basil to be happy. So again, keep it in a container, keep it close to the house. If you have a reflective south-facing wall, put it next to it, and wait for another month or so before you put it in the ground. There's nothing worse than putting basil in the ground when it's too cold and it just sort of collapses over a few days because it's so unhappy. The combination of having to keep it moist, which you have to do, and having it cold at night just encourages little critters, microscopic critters, to attack it, and it just collapses. What about squash? Squash will start to show up at the nurseries pretty soon. And again, it's a little cold now, but squash are very vigorous plants. And if you've got a nice sunny spot and your soil seems workable, or you're going to do it in a container, I would say when they're available, if they look healthy, go ahead and get them started. They're not going to make squash for a little while still while it's really cool. They'll probably only make male flowers. Squash plants have male flowers and female flowers. The male flowers have to fertilize the female flowers, and then they make the fruit. And the male flowers come out first, kind of like the male bees hovering around waiting for the females to come out of the ground. And when the female flowers finally open, then the pollen's available for them. But when it's too cold, you'll just have lots of male flowers. Learn to recognize those. It's real easy. They have just a thin little stem and no kind of bulb on the end of the stem that's going to become the fruit. And you can just eat those. The wonderful squash blossoms, delicious. You can deep fry them and make little squash fritters out of them. Terrific. And the pollen is very tasty and nutritious. So don't hesitate. Melons are the bane of our existence here in the Bay Area. Many areas, including here in Mill Valley, we never get warm enough to successfully grow melons in any quantity. And boy, I had some going last year, some little baby watermelons, sugar babies, and oh, they looked so beautiful. And when I cracked them open, they hadn't ripened at all. They had every sign, every outward sign of being ripe, but they were just horrible inside. So it's just really too cold. But in the East Bay, in the hotter parts, or down on the peninsula, it should be possible to grow melons, but don't start too early. June is a good time, or end of May, for starting melons. Otherwise, they're going to just get mildewed and have all kinds of problems when it's too cold.
Hey Dan, so we're starting to approach the end of our kind of timeline, but I have a couple questions here, kind of lead you into those right now. One of the ones that actually I didn't really know the answer to, have you ever grown rhubarb from seed? And do you know a little bit about like that, producing it from seed versus tuber?
I'm trying to think whether I've ever seen rhubarb seed. It probably exists. But on the other hand, I've never seen a rhubarb flower.
Right.
So I guess the real answer is I don't know. But I think it's pretty much produced from divisions. And on the other hand, I have had in some very small rhubarb plants. So I'll have to ask one of the growers. It's a great question. But
I guess
I've never
approach it. Approach it like any other seed.
Approach it like any other seed.
Approach it like any other seed. Yeah, probably. Do a little internet research, but if you have found seeds, I'd like to know. Yeah, it's a real interesting question. I don't really know the answer. For instance, artichokes are produced by divisions. The reason you probably wouldn't grow rhubarb from seed is that it has been selected for eons for the nice big tasty stems, and you would lose that selection process by just growing it out from seed. kind of like the artichokes. You grow them from divisions, they make beautiful flowers, they make lots of seeds. But if you plant the seeds, you get some wild ancestor of our modern artichoke. So I suspect that's the case with rhubarb, but I don't know.
Cool, yeah. Continuing on talking about seeds, someone was asking about possible expiration dates, or that they usually will get a packet of seeds and they'll use some of them because there's always a lot of them in there, and then they want to know what to do with the rest of them, if they can keep them for a while, or does that pose problems?
Yeah. Well, seeds often remain viable for a long time. If you don't use all the seeds, then put the package, so you know what it is or whatever, into like a old jam jar or something, and seal it up real tight, and keep it in a kind of cool spot where the sun doesn't shine on it. And what happens is they lose their viability kind of linearly. If you get 90% viability the first year, you'll get like 80% and then 70% and 60%. So it'll slowly wane, but they're usually good for a long time.
Yeah, and Taylor, Dan did a whole seed class. What was it? It was in January.
Yeah,
Nice.
So that's available. The recording's available, and that's all seeds. So a ton of info there.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, yeah, I'll have to check that one out. I didn't get to see that one. Very cool. All right, so continuing on, I have a question that was just basically about soil and having problems with water penetration in soil. Maybe the soil is getting compacted or beaten by the sun or something like that, and maybe some methods to just kind of freshen that up for spring.
Right. Soil that is compacted, you need to loosen up and aerate. What we talked about earlier, using the shovel and the fork to loosen it up, adding copious amounts of organic matter, which will help keep it loosened up. And then, for instance, if you're having trouble because it sits out there and gets pounded by rain during the winter, put a good mulch over it during the winter, and you'll find that the following spring it'll be nice and soft and easy to work. That can be straw, or it can be bark, or it can be almost anything that keeps the rain from just pounding it down. And the mulch will slowly decompose, and those humic acids will make the soil more workable.
Definitely, yeah.
The usual advice: organic matter, once you get plenty of organic matter into the soil, you just need to do minimal tillage to keep it nice and workable. There's a whole technique of gardening that doesn't till at all and just uses copious amounts of mulch. Most of us are, there are so many different questions that go into it that include aesthetic questions. Not everybody wants piles of straw around their yard. And if we have rodents and things like that, it gives them places to hide. So every situation is a little different, but what's common about all of this is add organic matter as often as you can. And whether that's a bag of compost or your home compost or some planting mix or whatever, manure, keep adding organic matter to your soil and it'll get better and better.
Nice. Perfect. I've been having a lot of fun answering the questions and looking through all of our chat. People have been asking some really good ones today. And so you've been talking about most of them. A lot of them are being covered. Definitely anything specific, we'd love to talk to you in the store. One last kind of area that we wanted to talk about before we head out today is aphids and pests and stuff like that. I know it's a very broad topic. It goes all the different directions. There's many ways to deal with it, but I know right now we're getting tender new growth, and what's the best thing to do about the pests that we're going to have?
Okay, well, one of the first things that come along are aphids, of course, and they're probably showing up right now. A hard stream of water is your first line of defense. there's a little product, I can't remember what the technical name is, but it's a little nozzle that you put on a hose that makes a
Bug blaster.
Bug
Bug
blaster.
blaster.
Yeah.
They actually work really well. We've used them out here. The camellias often get lots of aphids early in the season, and we've made a bug blaster area, and we just go out there and shoot the aphids off, and that works quite well with aphids. They need to be a colony constantly reproducing in order to do their thing. And so then later on, we can use ladybugs, pretty well control them. But it's too cold for the ladybugs right now, so I wouldn't get them yet. Later on in the season, you will get more munchy bugs, especially on some of the leafy crops. You'll start to see the white butterflies and that sort of thing. Lots of different ways to deal with that. There are chemical ways to deal with it. There's row cover is a real good idea. It's a white blanket that lets air and water through and sunlight, but keeps the flying insects from laying their eggs on the plants. And early in the season, that is a wonderful way to protect the plants. So I'll just suggest that. Blasting water and row cover as your first lines of defense. And then later on, come in and talk to us and we'll try to figure out what, identification is number one. You have to know what's eating you, and then we can be specific about what to do about it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, I think we are approaching our time, and I wanted to again thank everyone for joining us today where we're actually filming it, as well as everyone who sees this later on. All of these videos are on our website. They're also on our YouTube page. So Sloat Gardens is one to look for. I really appreciate everyone's support and all these questions. We had a really fun time. I answered as many questions as I could in the chat, and you guys were all very nice about it. And lots of praise and love towards you, Dan. So good job there. And then if everyone's interested, we're going to have a couple more coming up pretty soon. Again, we have Mediterranean climate planting coming up at this Wednesday. I think it's at 5 o'clock. Really good one about water-wise gardening there. And then we also have our citrus tree pruning coming up really soon. I'm really excited for that one. I love pruning trees, and Elizabeth Fries is a great speaker on it. And then we have tomatoes 101 coming up as well. So we're gonna be talking more and more about those tomatoes and those summer crops. So definitely check out that one. And yeah, watch all the other videos from the past. And enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Hopefully it's not raining too much. We can kind of get out there, but we're also getting some water. So that's good.
Thanks, Taylor.
No problem. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.